Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. I would like to welcome you to this webinar that ISD is hosting to present the findings of the first 4 reports launched under the Sustainable Commodities Marketplace Series, aiming to showcase production and consumption market information on a number of agricultural commodities. Thank you all for being with us today. Consumption and production of sustainable agricultural commodities is a topic of extremely importance, for which we have over 120 participants registered to this webinar. My name is Stephanie Bermudez. I am the co-author of these reports, along with Cristina Larrea and Vivek Vora. I am a member of the Sustainability Standards team at ISD that leads the State of Sustainability Initiatives project, and it is my pleasure to moderate this discussion with Cristina Larrea, Lead of Sustainability Standards Program from ISD, and with 4 remarkable guest speakers with vast experience working in the field of sustainable development. We have with us Cynthia Uwaku, Division Manager Export, Market Development and Innovation, and Alex Kurunzira, the Coffee Value Chain Specialist from the National Agricultural Export Development Board of Rwanda. We also have Julie Francoeur, the Executive Director of Fairtrade Canada, and Joel Brunen, the Country Director of Solidaridad Colombia. Welcome all to this webinar. I would like to go briefly through the agenda before we kick off. First, we will provide a background of ISD and the state of sustainability initiatives and about this series of reports, as well as the methodology used on data collection. Then we will move to the presentation of main results. As you may know, coffee and cocoa reports have already been launched this year. The tea report will be launched after this webinar, and the sugar report will be launched early next year. So we are happy to provide an advance of the main findings with you. We acknowledge that each commodity deserves its own webinar, but we will present the key findings for all in this opportunity. The webinar will have 2 parts. In the first one, we will showcase some trends on production and consumption of conventional and VSS-compliant coffee, cocoa, sugar, and tea. At the end of this section, we will discuss the findings with our guest speakers. Then, the second part will showcase the potential for expansion of VSS-compliant production in low human development countries as a way to potentially contribute to deliver sustainable development outcomes. We are also going to talk about challenges faced in these 4 commodity sectors at the farm at market levels. Again, at the end of this section, we will open the discussion with our guest speakers before moving to the Q&A with the audience. Please note that as a participant of this webinar, you can submit your questions in the Q&A chat on the bottom of your screen. Please identify yourself with your name, and I will address the question to whom appropriate. If you experience technical problems, thank you for letting us know using the chat function. For those of you just joining us, welcome. And without further ado, let's start with a brief background on the ISD and the ISD SSI series of reports on sustainable commodities. The International Institute for Sustainable Development is an independent think tank championing solutions to our planet's greatest sustainability challenges. About a decade ago, ISD contributed to establish the State of Sustainability Initiatives, which is an international transparency and capacity building project aimed at improving strategic planning and sustainable development outcomes related to voluntary sustainability standards. ISD has a different range of reports concerning voluntary sustainability standards that are available in our website. This year, we launched the Sustainable Commodities Marketplace Series that aims at providing a market performance outlook on global consumption and production trends of 8 agricultural commodities in a short, easy-to-read format that targets different stakeholders, including producers, value chain actors, and government institutions. Each year, the series focuses on a different overarching theme. The 2019 edition explores the potential for expanding VSS-compliant production in low human development countries. To give you more details about our data collection strategy, we collect two types of data. For production data on VSS-compliant commodities, we worked in collaboration between ISD, FIBL, and ITC to collect data directly from a number of voluntary sustainability standards. In 2018, we collected data updated as of 2016. This is the type of data that we use in this series of reports. In 2020, we expect to collect data updated as of 2018. As for consumption data, we have collaborated with different actors, such as HIVUS, authors of the coffee and tea barometers. We also have obtained data related to consumption from the cocoa barometer, published by the Voice Network. We also have worked on collecting data directly with main buyers, so we managed to obtain sourcing volumes on VSS compliant for different commodities as well as sourcing commitments. We also obtained data related to consumption from literature review. Our goal for the next series of reports is to map out the 80% of VSS compliant purchases by standard and by country. This will be really useful to see what the regional trends are. Again, these efforts are aimed to create the Sustainable Commodities Marketplace Series to provide an overview of consumption and production trends and performance of sustainable and conventional markets for economic planning. So with this introduction, let's start with showcasing the main findings related to the consumption and production trends of our four commodities. I will invite my colleague Christina to continue. Please, Christina.
Thank you very much, Steph, and welcome all to this webinar. Just to provide a bit of background of these four commodity markets, they play an important role in contributing to producer livelihoods for cocoa, coffee, sugar, and tea. For instance, for cocoa, tea, and coffee, at least 70% of farmers working in the sector are smallholder farmers. The sugar sector employs worldwide 100 million people in total, including smallholder farmers. For instance, Thailand reports about 100,000 smallholder farmers in the sugarcane sector. Also, coffee, cocoa, tea, and sugar are grown in a number of low human developed countries, from 12 in the tea sector to 30 in sugar. And a number of these countries produce already volumes of these commodities compliant to at least one voluntary sustainability standard. Given this outreach, the potential contribution of these four commodities to farmer livelihoods, community development, and environmental resilience is notable. In addition, these four commodities involve many actors in the supply chain, from traders all the way to retailers and end consumers. And in some cases, we find examples of vertical integration such as in tea. Sugar, coffee, cocoa, and tea are traded in global markets. However, each one has its own particularities. For instance, the production of coffee is largely exported as it is processed and consumed in traditional markets such as European Union and North America, while for tea and sugar, the volume of production is less exported as it is largely consumed in producing countries, as we are going to see later. For cocoa, an estimated half of cocoa beans are exported for further processing, as there is an increasing volume of cocoa processed in producing countries. Given the notable global consumption of coffee, cocoa products, tea, and products containing sugar, their market share value at retail skyrocketed in recent years, ranging from around 50 billion USD dollars in tea and sugar sector to 80 to 100 billion in coffee and cocoa chocolate sector, as reported to a number of market research companies. And this market value is expected to grow and to continue. So following this background, let's have a look at the production trends of these four commodities. As we see in this graph, minimum of a standard compliant production for coffee, cocoa, and tea has increased considerably in the period 2008-2016 at an impressive compound annual growth rate of 24, 46, and 35 respectively, while conventional production decreased significantly in coffee and cocoa and was maintained at about zero in the tea sector. If we consider the latest data recently published, this growth continues in 2017 besides for coffee, where we see a drop in production volumes compliant to a voluntary sustainability standard. As of 2016, the share of standard compliant coffee is at least 34% of the market, for cocoa 29%, and for tea 19% of total production in their respective markets. For sugarcane production, during the period of evaluation, standard compliant increased considerably at a compound annual growth rate of 51% with the start of Bonsokro in 2011, while conventional production maintained its level of production in the period with minimal growth. Despite this impressive growth, standard compliant sugarcane production captured only a 3% of total sugarcane production. Considering the recently published data as of 2017, the growth of standard compliant sugar production continues. It's important to remark that sugar is not as much as a consumer-faced commodity as cocoa, tea, and coffee. So it's a huge difference that we're going to discuss later. So following this overview of production trends, let's go to have a look at consumption trends. With this first commodity series, as Stephanie mentioned, we innovate building from prior works led by coffee and cocoa barometers to expand the study on consumer trends and preferences of a selection of commodities compliant to voluntary sustainability standards. So let's have a look at, the main trends of our findings. For consumption of conventional coffee and cocoa-based products, we see a similar trend. Demand is increasing in traditional markets, such as European and North America, and in emerging economies, especially in Asia Pacific, due to greater disposable income, middle-class growth, and youth preferences to consume these commodities. The leading products that drive this growth are ready-to-drink for coffee, chocolate made for single origin, premium and dark chocolate in European and North America, and cocoa ingredients used to produce biscuits and other patisseries in Asia Pacific. However, for consumption of standard compliant coffee and cocoa-based products, the situation is slightly different for both commodities. For coffee, we find that the demand is concentrated mainly in traditional markets, such as European and North America, and it is expected to grow in these markets, but mainly concentrated here. Despite this forecast, in our research, we found that an estimated oversupply of a standard compliant coffee in the market, which means that sustainable coffee is not sold as such. In contrast, for cocoa, we found that demand of standard compliant cocoa-based products, including chocolate, is growing in European and North America, and is expected to grow faster than conventional in these markets according to different studies. For instance, Euromonitor a report like for chocolate confectionery from sustainable cocoa sources accounted for 8% of the total global retail market value in 2017 and is expected to continue. For tea and sugar, let's have a look at these two other sectors. The situation is slightly different as these commodities are more consumed in producing countries, which are largely developing or emerging economies. For conventional tea, demand is increasing in Asia Pacific, driven by the perceived health benefits of tea, new flavors, fruit fusions, and ready-to-drink tea. While demand of standard compliant tea is focused mainly in European and North American countries, as tea-producing countries tend towards consumer conventionally grown options over more costly sustainable versions. However, we found in our research that there is a sign that this trend might be shifting as there are new standards or sustainable schemes developed locally in India and Indonesia, for instance, with the example of Strass Tea and Lestery, that are encouraging corporate and buyers at local level, like for instance, Tata in India, to procure sustainable source tea. For the sugar market, an estimated 75% of sugar, according to, I think, FAO and OECD, is consumed in developing countries. And demand of sugar for human consumption is expected to continue growing in these countries for multiple reasons: processed products, confectionery products, soft drinks. While in developed countries, demand of sugar is decreasing due to health concerns related to high levels of sugar consumption, which have influenced to some extent corporate procurement programs and intake of end consumers. In summary, in our research, we found that developing countries, emerging economies, with a special focus in Asia Pacific for certain commodities, are driving consumption of these four commodities and derived products, while consumption of more sustainable versions of these commodities are not growing at the same pace in these markets, leading, for the case of coffee and sugar, for an estimated oversupply, which might be to a lesser extent in the tea sector. There is then an attempt potential to further explore this growth of sustainable consumption in these countries that we're going to discuss later on with our guest speakers. In this initial study on consumer preferences of standard compliant commodities, we have also looked into sustainable sourcing volumes and commitments of leading buyers, continuing the work of Coffee and Cocoa Barometer. I suggest refer to the reports to review these data in detail, but let's have a look at some of the key estimators and findings. For instance, for coffee, approximately 34% of sourcing volumes of 10 main roasters come from sustainable sources, either corporate schemes, as you know, buyers have established in some cases their own corporate sustainability schemes, or voluntary sustainability standards. For cocoa, 5 main manufacturers procure around 48% of their sourcing volumes from sustainable sources. For tea, according to our estimations based on available data, which sometimes is limited, reported by the buyers, we find that the percentage of volume sourced from sustainable sources range between 60 and 80, being higher for tea being sold in European and North American markets. For sugar, this percentage is about 30%. And again, those are estimations that you are able to have a look at the report. These numbers and estimations, we understand, back up in a way our research on consumer preferences that suggests that indeed there is progress in consumption of standard compliant or sustainable commodities for coffee, cocoa, tea, and sugar, but still their levels are low or lower than supply. Okay.
Good, Christina. Thank you very much for presenting these trends on consumption and production of these four commodities. So let's start this conversation with our guest speakers. And I would like to ask Julie, Executive Director of Fairtrade Canada, what are your thoughts in relation to the VSS-compliant production trends for these four commodities, which have registered an important increase during the last years, particularly for coffee and cocoa? In your perspective, what are the main drivers behind this growth?
Hi, good morning. Is my voice clear?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, great. What we've seen is quite different in the four categories. So in cocoa and coffee, we've seen very strong growth of all types of voluntary certification, really, and some consumption. And we've seen the drive in this be very different when the decision was taken by the producers themselves. So new producers deciding that they want to become certified or they want to become part of a voluntary standard. And a lot of that has been driven by very low prices in coffee and cocoa in the past few years. So when you have a trend of very low market prices, there's a clear incentive for producers themselves to say, well, I want to have a chance at getting a better price, and some voluntary standards allow that, such as fair trade certification or others. So whenever we see a very low price, keeping for a certain amount of time, then we see a surge in amount of certification. Sometimes it's matched with a surge in demand, and sometimes the demand stays flat at the same time. What we've seen is also a driver that has been consumer and company led. So both consumer demand for goods that are more aligned to their values, And we've seen this in North America, probably with a delay to Europe. So in Europe, that was stronger and faster earlier on, and North America is now catching up. We're also seeing a small trend, I think you hinted at it a little bit in Asia, in Japan and Korea, Singapore, where consumers there, especially of coffee and chocolate, are starting to demand more sustainability in the products that they purchase. So then companies have to respond. And in sugar, we've seen the growth in the demand more led by the companies themselves. So where it's not consumer facing as much, but they want to know that they have a stable supply. They want to form stronger relationships with their provider and start to ask questions about the sustainability there, whether it's for a carbon neutral objective that the company has, or whatever environmental and human rights obligation that the company is under. So we've seen it as company driven and not so much even shared with the public. So this is how we've seen it grow.
Great, thank you, Julie. So we have two main ideas here. So first, new producers want to become part of a voluntary sustainability standard due to multiple factors, including the low prices in the markets, but also values. And the second main idea is that this growing is driven by other factors that also depend on each commodity, such as consumer demands or buyers' commitments as well. So with this idea, I would like to ask Cynthia and Alexis, that you are two representatives from the Agricultural Export Agency of one of the countries that produce and export coffee and tea, which is Rwanda. So I would like to ask you, in your experience, what are the main drivers that have permitted the growth of this VSS-compliant production in least developing countries, such as Rwanda, during the last years? And what are the main challenges that you have faced for that growth?
Thank you very much for the question. In terms of
sorry, Cynthia, we cannot hear you well. Can you please repeat your answer? Thank you.
Let me see if I can adjust my, can you hear me now?
Yeah, now it's much better.
Okay. Yes, basically like Julie just said, to a certain degree, it is one of the main factors in customer
Sorry, Cynthia, we cannot hear you well. While you arrange these sound issues, maybe we are going to pass a question to Joel. So Joel, you as a country manager of Solidaridad in Colombia, and you have this vision of the consumer trends. How do you see the increase of corporate initiatives, corporate schemes being created and adopted by big buyers in these sectors? What this means for the future of voluntary sustainability standards?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the question, Stephanie. What we have seen, there are different reasons for companies to initiate these initiatives themselves. Some of companies have been working very successfully on these sustainability schemes. And actually, what we see is they can add value to existing certification standard on specific topics. I think a good example is, for example, a company like Nespresso that has been working with its very stringent AAA corporate supply chain program, but is also using the Rainforest Alliance standard as one of its building blocks. So we see that as a certain complementarity between one and the other. However, we also see that companies currently, in some cases, freeze the volume or reduce the volume of VSS, voluntary sustainability standard certified products, and push the growth in their sustainable supply through their self-made corporate programs. So if corporate programs are adding up to these voluntary sustainability standards, then it's definitely a win-win for producers and buyers. It also keeps pressure on the voluntary sustainability standards to keep proving its value, but also to innovate. On the other hand, if corporate programs are using, if this is used to dilute, you can say it like that, to the sustainability criteria of its supply, then we should consider this also as undermining the market transformation or affecting credibility of end consumers in buying a sustainable product.
Good, thank you, Joel. So we can understand that they are complementary and they are pushing the VSS to innovate. So I think we can have a last round of questions before passing to our next section. So I would like to ask Julie, as we have seen and as you have mentioned, this consumption of VSS-compliant commodities is driven mainly by end consumer preferences and by commitments from buyers. I would like to ask you, is that enough to transform consumption habits towards purchasing more sustainable products and maybe expand production? So what do we need to expand these habits or transform these habits?
The work that we do with consumers or that we do with companies is one part, and it needs to be expanded, so both better funded and better coordinated in different markets. And we see a lot of expansion of that in the South as well. So we've seen, you know, a beginning of big consumer movements in Brazil, for example, or even in, we have producers of tea who sell sustainable tea within Kenya, within their own territories. So that's starting. But what we're starting to realize too is that it doesn't work if there's no further government involvement as well. I think needs to be a level of regulation on both in producing countries and in consuming countries. So in consuming countries, we're looking at things like advocacy that needs to be done around transparency of supply chain, around human rights due diligence that should be done by companies in their supply chain to understand where their goods come from, where their commodities come from, and transparency of payments. And then in origin countries, it's the involvement of governments, not necessarily to adopt the voluntary standards, but to create a protection level of commodity producers in their countries. So it's been interesting to follow, for example, in Ivory Coast and Ghana, the decisions by the governments to start creating price regulation for cocoa farmers, or sometimes it can be around price. In other countries, it's more regulation that are being implemented at government level on environmental protection, or on trade supply and trade transparency. So regulation, it needs to work hand in hand so that it isn't voluntary. Voluntary can work for expansion at when producers are ready and when supply chains are ready to take it on. But there needs to be a level playing field so that you don't have such a big gap between the conventional production and the kind of best-in-class sustainability approach. And without regulation, it's hard to see how we can move there in a time frame that we need to have more sustainable commodities. And maybe as a second part to what we've started to have to do in supply chains that are quite long. So as you were saying, some are fully integrated like tea, or we see it in other commodities like bananas where the supply chains are much shorter. But in supply chains such as coffee or cocoa or sugar, there's a long list of intermediaries. Sometimes even in the producer country, in coffee, for example, the coffee could have changed hands, more than 10 times and still be within its producing origin. And same here in Canada, for example, or in the US, where it will be traded or repackaged and roasted and then distributed and then the retailer. So it's having to bring on board a lot more of these actors and not just a purchaser, a trader and producer, but work with everyone in the chain. So convincing retailers, the brand holders, And this is a long game to play if there is no regulation that forces these people to want to be at the table.
Good, Julie. Thank you very much. Indeed, this is a very important point. So it worth to know that demand not only depends on end consumers, but also we need this governmental involvement as well. And here is where the voluntary sustainability standards can complement this trend. So I just want to check with Cynthia. Are you there? If you may want to add something to the discussion, maybe we have seen that this concentration in very specific regions, mainly in the north, in European countries, in North America, for VSS compliant consumption. So what will be an effective strategy to break this dependency and maybe to promote this domestic consumption of VSS compliant tea, coffee, cocoa, and sugar, for instance, in the East African region? Is that possible for you?
I hope you can hear me a bit clearer now.
It's much better, thank you.
Okay. It is very important looking at different ways of being able to domestically create our own demand and not to fully depend on the traditional areas where we've been depending on for demand for our coffee and tea. And then in a place like Rwanda, the government is highly involved in various initiatives across the board, all the way from production to access to markets. And there are a number of initiatives that the private sector within Rwanda that has taken that can be a great example in looking at different ways to increase local consumption. Within Rwanda at this particular point, although we produce tea and coffee, the local consumption rate for both is well below 5% of total production. Within tea, there are different initiatives that have been taken in the past and new ones that are being worked on to see how we can increase the demand for our tea locally, in terms of ensuring that the tea is going to be affordable for different ranges of Rwandans. So there are initiatives in terms of the type of packaging or the size of the packaging to ensure that at the end of the day, it's cost effective and it's going to reach a wider range of people within Rwanda. Give them a chance to actually taste the tea that they're producing. There are initiatives around tea day or coffee day all over the country in predominantly rural areas where we prepare tea or coffee for the population and give them a chance to taste it. Take some time to teach them about the different health benefits around it. There's also an increase in different coffee shops within the country to ensure that we're giving that as many people as possible are getting an opportunity to be able to first interact with the tea or the coffee. In terms of coffee also, we've reached a level where there are very low cost kiosks that are coming up around the country, again, to target specifically the people who can't afford, who predominantly think that they can't afford to buy these commodities, to make it more accessible to them. So while it's something that will take a while, but it is very possible to promote domestic consumption. And in the long run, that is a key area that we need to focus on to ensure the sustainability of these products, of these commodities. We need to ensure that we can at least be able to consume a certain quantity that also gives us a bit more of, how would I say it? Gives us a bit more room to negotiate. It gives us a leg to stand on to negotiate. Because when you're looking at coffee, the prices are fluctuating every other day, every other week. So we need to be able to have some room as well to negotiate on, which the promotion of domestic consumption is going to be quite helpful on. So I believe this can be done. Rwanda as a country is slowly trying to work towards it to prove that it can be done. And it's really crucial for the sustainability of these commodities.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Cynthia. So we can say, at least in the Rwandan experience, that at the consumption level, this is increasing, it's growing, but we need also time and more efforts to expand this consumption. Now, just going back to the first question, in your experience, what are the main drivers, this is from the production side, that have permitted this growth of VSS compliant production in countries such as Rwanda during the last years?
The main drivers are, one of the main drivers is going to be that, that it's going to be customer driven. In terms of markets that we are currently exporting our coffee and tea to, the different requirements that are within the markets tend to be one of the main drivers. As in also looking in terms of the farmers and the exporters, improvement in welfare, in the way the practices at farm level, the fact that these certifications, these standards require for investment in terms of capacity building within the farmers themselves. And the fact that at the end of the day, these products will eventually be able to yield a better revenue for the farmers at the end of the day. So those are around the main drivers.
Good. Then thank you, Cynthia. So it is mainly a question of market demand, and this is in line in some way with the figures that Christina showed to us and what Julie also said before. So very good. Thank you all for these very important highlights. Let's continue with the presentation, with the second part of this webinar. So we have seen that for some sectors, particularly for coffee and cocoa, the growth of VSS compliant production is outpacing conventional one. But there are different scenarios for the consumption of VSS compliant commodities, which we hope will increase, especially in developing countries and emerging economies, as we recently discussed. So this could potentially boost the VSS compliant production of these commodities in low human development countries as a livelihood strategy that aims to contribute to social, environmental, and economic resilience. So let's follow to get a deeper insight on this potential and how it was addressed in these reports. I will let Christina to continue.
Thank you. Well, basically building from what Cynthia was mentioning from Rwanda, I mean, there are a number of initiatives that are working to close the gap of assessing the impact of a standard compliant production on the ground of these commodities, such as, for instance, COSA, CL, among others. So there is still a knowledge gap in the sense to understand at a larger scale both the contribution of a standard compliant production to deliver sustainable development outcomes, as well as their limits or areas for continued improvement. Having said that, we find studies that report benefits from standard compliant production of these commodities, such as, for instance, access to premiums for workers and improved fair farmer incomes, such as greater conservation of natural resources, water, forest, biodiversity. In case of tea plantations, better working conditions, the strengthening of resilience to climate change, enforcement of labor and human rights, and complement the role of the protection of human rights at the state level, as well as increased product traceability and integral management system based on the capacity building that standards provide at farmer level, building from the what Cynthia mentioned. So when properly implemented, The expansion of standard compliant coffee, cocoa, tea, and sugar in low human development countries could result in an important environmental and societal development benefits via the adoption of more sustainable practices. So that's something that we consider, and there is a potential there to explore. So we have conducted an analysis. We have conducted an analysis to understand a macroeconomic analysis to understand what is the potential for expanding sustainable coffee, cocoa, tea in low human development countries. And the methodology that we have used to this macro analysis is designed by our colleague Vivek and looks at potential for expansion of a standard compliant production in low human development countries, considering three factors: total production, so existing volume of production, presence of a standard compliance or production or presence of voluntary sustainability standards, and human development index. I invite you to explore a bit more the results and the analysis in the reports where we see where this potential might happen, but as provide some examples here. For instance, for compliant coffee and expansion, we see the area of in Eastern Africa, like Ethiopia and Uganda, having the potential to expand, as well as Ivory Coast. For the cocoa sector, we continue to see the role of the West Coast to expand standard compliant production, given the current volumes of total production. For sugar, I mean, is quite widespread, the production of sugar cane in low human development countries. So in this analysis, it highlights the role of sugar, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. And for tea, the potential role of Mozambique, Uganda, and Burundi to expand the share of a standard compliant production from the total volume of production and potentially bring sustainable development benefits like economic, social, and environmental. So, but there are challenges in that process that, I mean, Cynthia started a bit to document, but we would like to highlight some of these challenges that we found in our research and distinguish at both the market level and farmer level. At market level, indeed, there is an issue of price volatility and price decline, for instance, particularly for coffee. There is a lack of demand in certain markets, as we have seen for standard compliant production, even though it's growing. Okay, there is still a demand for more growth, as Julie mentioned, and the need for regulation for that. In some markets like tea, for instance, and cocoa, there is a market concentration and income disparity across the value chain. So the campaigns for living income at farmer level is are relevant and that angle. There's regular export fluctuations that create a market effect, for different countries, and obviously the climate change effects in that farmers and buyers and traders face, shifting weather patterns, as well as pests and diseases in certain commodities, such as, for instance, tea. At farmer level, we also find challenges that are being treated at some degree and need to be treated also to continue increasing standard compliant production, like high certification cost or additional cost due to multiple certification, and difficulty in achieving the criteria that standards set up, and that's why the capacity building effort is needed and continue to be needed. In some cases, such as we have seen in coffee, there is an existing oversupply of standard compliant production, which limits the benefits of selling at a better price. And obviously, environmental challenges that farmers face at, building resilience towards climate change mitigation, as well as poor working conditions that are reported in some tea plantations. So, I mean, this is a very high level overview we can find in reports. And those challenges are existing, and we know there are initiatives starting from standards, extension services and governments are trying to address that, but still more efforts are needed. So I will pass on the word to Stephanie to continue the discussion.
Thank you, Christina, for presenting the methodology and some of the main challenges that the sectors face at farm level and at market level. So let's take a moment to discuss these results with our guest speakers before jumping to the Q&A section. So just as a reminder, I will invite you all to send your questions in the Q&A chat on the bottom of your screen. So I will start with Julie, asking you to provide some examples of best practices that Fairtrade has in order to increase VSS-compliant production of tea, cocoa, coffee, or sugar in a least developed country, and maybe tackle some of these challenges that Christina just mentioned?
Yeah, so one example that comes to mind, because it's a country that's very linked to that crop, is the work that we've been able to do in Ethiopia with coffee. So Ethiopia has really large cooperatives of small farmers, and differently to our older work that we have done for a much longer time in coffee in Latin America, where we have smaller cooperatives with farmers who have each bigger land sizes, so slightly larger fields. In Ethiopia, we would find cooperatives such as the Oromia cooperative, which has over 200,000 members within the cooperative, and very small farms. And so the capacity there to structure it formally and to strengthen the cooperative is core to how we could work with them. And so we've started working with the Oromia cooperative in 2002. And so they've been with fair trade for close to 20 years almost by now, and the enabling factor with them has really been the capacity of the women within the co-op and the men within the co-op to form a transparency in the way they would deal with each other in such a large group. So both in the formalization of the institutionalization of the cooperative and in its functionality and the services that it could provide, but also in referring back to what I was talking about in terms of government support, is also the fact that Ethiopia, having coffee as its main export crop, also has a lot of incentive to invest in the support of its farmers at a government level as well. So the mix of government support, of good field actors on the ground, so of support agencies and agronomists, has been creating this environment where things could work. But it was also the capacity for them to say early on, how could we, being in a least developed country, where do we invest the extra income that we would get from being a fair trade certified co-op and being able to sell really good quality coffee? So right away, the investments in those countries are quite different to what we would see in a more developed country, where some of the state infrastructure is more sound. So in Ethiopia, what we've started to see is the farmers invest a big portion really early on into ensuring better quality of the crop. So processing facilities, quality and capacity training, so that they could have a higher price for all of their coffee, regardless of whether they manage to sell it on a voluntary standard market or not. And so increasing the quality to access better prices, and then as a second portion to also increase diversification for food security. So bringing in farmers' knowledge on other fruit trees, on small vegetable production as well. So we're seeing this this expansion and financial literacy to be built with them. And it's been an interesting case to follow. We've seen a few others at Ivory Coast in West Africa, and in Papua New Guinea, for example. But it's really a different context, obviously, than what we would see when we work, for example, in a much more developed country with the same crops.
Sure, thank you, Julie. So I would like to know, what were the enabling factors to achieve this? It was more a government role, it was the buyers intermediation, or it was actually the producers organization, the network of producers there?
I would say from the first one, or the most important one that we almost see everywhere, is the producer organization themselves. And sometimes doesn't mean that we started with a very strong producer organization, but the fact that there were some key individuals at first and producers wanting to be organized, especially in commodities where you have very small producers. Obviously, one farmer alone is really hard to change the situation. So having a strong organized producer organization then enables the other factors to come in, enables the government to want to be helping them, because they see that it's going to have a bit of a lever by using the whole cooperative or federation. And the buyer's interest as well to say, okay, well, this particular cooperative or this particular union of farmers delivers a good crop. It makes sense for me to invest there. And so everything followed after that. So This is where we put then the focus is on strengthening them initially so that they're a group strong enough to be able to, go after funding, to go after quality investment, and to see what do they need to be strengthened as a producer organization. But yeah, that was definitely the number one factor in making that possible.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Julie, for presenting these interesting approaches and best practices that fair trade is implementing. So I would like to pass the word to Joel and ask him about an interesting trend. So we have seen that more and more in developing and emerging economies in emerging countries, there are sustainability standards that are being developed either by the private sector or by the public sector. How do you see this trend? Why is this happening?
Again, I think sustainability standards, even local standards, should be complementary or as a stepping stone. And I think if it is like that, it is a good development. But what we have seen so far, emerging markets perhaps have been too long left out of sight from a market perspective. And what we see is that in some cases, these national standards come up as a result of that perception that international voluntary sustainability standards do not sufficiently address or approximate these local conditions. So there's not a sufficient match for that. So it can be an opportunity that these national standards are used as a stepping stone to generate even more local market uptake. And I think but there's also, let's say, a risk that it can also lower the bar too much. Lower the bar, but also in terms of creating confusion about different consumers, about the amount of different standards that are there. However, what we see is that there's a very strong need of private players in these markets to get also, let's say, a certain visibility about what they do in sustainability. And I'm talking about big companies that can be multi-Asian or multi-Latin companies that are listed on international stock markets and working actively on transparency and sustainability improvements in their supply chain. So lots of these companies perhaps are not so much on the global radar, but they're definitely visible in these emerging markets. And they sometimes want to, put their own brand or mark on that, specifically that sustainability standard. So I think in the end, it will create, let's say, much more awareness about a public of consumers in emerging countries, that they can wake up or can actively say, hey, yes, I can get that product also in my own home market. So I think it's a positive sign. And taking consideration that emerging markets, they can be very considerable in terms of size. So to give you an example with coffee, we're talking about in 2018 about 61 million bags of green coffee produced by Brazil. But out of that 61 million, 21 million are being consumed in Brazil. And that's a huge volume if you consider specifically the gap between what also was earlier mentioned in the presentation, the gap between the certified sustainable production and the certified sustainable sales. So I think it's definitely a good development, and I think it should also be boosted by public authorities to complement their social and economic agendas in these countries to create rural development in a lot of these communities that we attend also with these standards. So I think there's a connection with what was earlier mentioned by Julie, that the role of public governments there can be very positive.
Good. Thank you very much, Joel, for your insights on this. So I think we already have some questions from the audience. So we are ready to open this section. So we have here a question from Adeline. She's asking, and I think you, Joel, can tackle this question. How do you envisage the impact of VSS of upcoming regulatory measures from the European Union on addressing sustainability risk of imported commodities, and in particular for cocoa?
I think I think specifically in some commodities like cocoa, where you see issues coming up, for example, the cadmium requirements that are, let's say, for European market and requirement, and for a lot of countries, it's difficult to match. I think that's I think a lot of countries should consider that these are market entry requirements that should be addressed more and more, also in a more general VSS standards. I think standards in itself are not, let's say, you call it, they're also living items. They change, they're updated, but in the end, they should be considered as a tool to get to a certain specific, let's say, production model, or let's say it's more sustainable requirements, rather than a goal in itself. So I think in that sense, the VSS should include that sooner or later, because in the end, it's the legal compliance that usually is the bottom line for entry in markets.
Good, thank you very much, Joel. So I have a question for Cynthia. Having this vision from VSS, such as fair trade, and this experience that Joel just have mentioned, and their work in developing countries. So I am curious to know, in your perspective, how can governments and export agencies, such as NAEB in Rwanda, help to expand this production of commodities compliant with voluntary sustainability standards in the national processes? So what is your experience in the country, or even in the East African region, with these interactions between the voluntary sustainability standards and the national regulations?
Thank you. Looking at it again from what we're doing currently, the government is highly involved, through NAEB, is highly involved, again, from production to market access, through providing trainings and certification processes, ensuring that there's capacity building on like various agricultural practices that again lead and go back to the certification processes, through advocating and supporting with the costs involved in being compliant with the voluntary standards. Basically enabling and supporting the private sector to ensure that they're compliant through this, even to a level of ensuring that the private sector, the farmers on ground, are incentivized to keep producing compliant commodities. There are a number of initiatives, again, that are ongoing, support that's being given all the way from seedlings to post-harvesting facilities to assist with the heavy investment that is needed on the farmers' behalf to be compliant. So the government is highly involved and supporting and providing as much support as is needed to ensure that we're expanding in terms of production, but also that the production is compliant with the standards.
Good, thank you very much, Cynthia. So I think that was the last question for today. So just to wrap up, I think we have very important points that have been raised along the discussion. So first, we can say that there is a potential to expand this production of VSS compliant and consumption as well, not only in traditional markets, but also in producing countries and low human development countries when we talk about production. This potential, of course, needs to be assessed against these risks and challenges that all the sector faces. We can say low farm prices, farm profitability, the effects of the climate change, and the quality, supply, and demand for VSS-compliant commodities. However, we can say that these voluntary sustainability standards can be an important development vehicle within these countries when properly implemented, as they can potentially improve these socioeconomic and environmental conditions at farm and community levels. Of course, we can say as well that the government should play an important role on providing an enabling environment to support the expansion of these VSS compliant production. So it was a very rich conversation, and I hope you have enjoyed. Thank you all our guests, Cynthia, Julie, Joel, for being with us today. Christina, thank you for presenting the findings of this series of reports. And thank you all the participants that stayed with us. Please stay tuned for our tea report that will be launched this week, for the sugar tea report that will be launched early next year, and the coming reports on bananas, palm oil, cotton, and soybean next year. Remember that the key findings of these reports are also available in our website, isd.org/SSI. We will also share the recorded version of this webinar with you. So thank you all for being with us today, and I wish you a very good rest of the day. Thank you very much.